Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 588. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, so just a quick reminder to promote the show in some way to help us to spread the word, and then I'll get right into the news. We are hosted at the Libertarian Institute, which is the best place to find the show, and almost all the writing that I do is there. We also repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, where I'm the news editor, and I also write some news stories for antiwar.com on the weekends. Subscribe to the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, and it's up anywhere that you can listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. Well, I post this show and everything else I do, all the articles I write and everything like that. All right, everybody. Let's get into the news today. The first up here is an article I wrote for the Institute on May 5th. U.S. struggles to unite allies on plan to seize Russian assets. So the White House is struggling to persuade even its closest allies to support a plan to seize Russian assets. Members of NATO hold hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian funds, with the Biden administration arguing they should be sold off to arm or rebuild Ukraine. The Financial Times reported that Washington's plan to seize Moscow's assets was a topic of concern at the Group of 20 G20 Finance Minister Summit in Brazil earlier this year. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. and its allies in the Group of 7, that's the G7, and NATO froze $300 billion in Russian assets. As the war has dragged into its third year, the White House has strained its ability to continue funding Kiev's war machine. Part of Washington's solution is to begin seizing those frozen Russian assets to fund the proxy conflict, which would be an unprecedented move. While the US, Canada, and members of the UK government, such as David Cameron, more on him later, support the plan, other allies, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union, are skeptical. Dividing the G7 has become a stalemate, but the Biden administration does not plan to act alone, suggesting that this plan isn't going to happen at this time. Dalip Singh, a White House Deputy National Security Advisor, explained, "We immobilized the Russian assets together. We would like to mobilize them together as well." The Europeans feel Washington is only willing to take such a hardline approach because the U.S. holds only a small amount of the frozen Russian assets, about 5 million. One European diplomat told FT they have little skin in the game. G7 officials also expressed concern that seizing the assets would violate international law, open their nations up to reparation demands from former colonies, and cause some countries, such as Saudi Arabia, to pull their own sovereign assets from Western financial institutions. And so the Saudi Arabia one, is an interesting example because you have countries, Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, China, were all mentioned in this article as countries that support or who have a lot of financial ties with these Western markets. They keep some of their assets in these Western countries, and I guess they see the writing on the wall here, and you may say, well, Saudi Arabia is almost an ally. India is almost an ally. Indonesia, kind of an ally. China, doesn't really fall into that same category. But at the same time, they do understand that they're not a part of the core U.S. empire in the way that the UK, Israel, France, Germany, Japan, Australia really are. And, even when Biden took office, he ran on a position of he was going to turn the Saudis into a pariah state. And so any country who falls into that category of someone who, if they violate the U.S. whims even, could end up on the blacklist or the list of bad countries that get punished by the U.S., and one of the ways could be seizing their assets. So the European countries, I think, are concerned that this is going to harm their economies because there's going to be a massive outflow of this foreign financial assets that they hold, because everybody's going to be afraid to keep them there because, again, if they upset the U.S., they could be stolen. So some members of the G7 argue that the seizure of Russian funds was no longer on the table, and they said they were exploring other methods of using those assets to benefit Ukraine. There's a couple of plans that were talked about in the article. One calls for using those Russian funds as collateral for Ukrainian loans, and that one sounded, to me, that would be an absolute tragical nightmare to think of, who's actually taking on the risk and liability there, because it seems very little possibility that Ukraine would really ever be able to pay back that loan. And if Russia comes seeking that money one day, well, who's going to be responsible for paying it? Do the financial institutions also have to pay Russia and eat that cost? Do the nations who encourage those financial institutions to do it, are they going to really try to maybe seize Ukrainian assets, right? Or gain control over things in Ukraine to have a steady, flow of billions of dollars of every year, and that's what they're going to use to pay this off? I think there would be a lot of questions around that plan. The proposal that seems the most likely is that they want to use the profits generated from the frozen assets, which is about going to be an estimated $3 billion per year, in order to give that money to Ukraine. So they're going to tell the Russians, look, what we froze in 2022, we won't touch that, but any interest that comes off of that money, any other profits, we're going to go ahead and give to Ukraine. I think there are multiple problems with that. The first is, similar to just seizing the money in the first place, it sets up this future problem, right? Where one day Moscow is going to ask for that money. And one German official said, if there's ever a peace negotiation and Ukraine decides to participate, there might be a situation where Russia demands its frozen assets back in exchange agrees to make territorial concessions to Ukraine. You can't do that if you have already mortgaged those assets. So they're saying that, look, this could be used as a positive bargaining chip for the Ukrainians, and we could be taking it off the table for them if we use these assets. And again, I think the biggest problem here would be is it would set up a more politically untenable problem for ending the war in Ukraine, where, let's say, Russia's asking for its money back and some of this money is already spent. Well, the political hit you would take in the United States by, taking any U.S. money and then giving that to Russia. I mean, we had the Iranian funds actually frozen for decades on end, right? When Iran agreed to buy weapons from the U.S., but they had change of government before the weapons were delivered, and so we kept the money and the weapons. Eventually, some of those funds were released by Barack Obama during the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and that was portrayed as, oh, we're giving Iran American money. What the horror is awful. Ayatollah is going to use it to kill Americans. Terrible, terrible, right? So imagine if they actually had spent those funds, right, and they had, say, given that money to Iraq or Israel or whoever else in the Middle East, right? And then, you had to actually take money from the U.S. budget to give to the Iranians. I mean, that would have been completely politically untenable. So I think this is a real way to wind up this war in such a way that it could almost never be unwound from the perspective of Washington. So while, some European countries are saying, this is off the table, not going to happen, U.S. officials say that Kiev badly needs the fund. So Singh argued that the risk that Ukraine is not sufficiently funded and the most egregious violations of international law in recent histories occur with impunity. And so she's saying that we got to give them the funds. And besides U.S. allies, a number of other countries have expressed concerns over the potential seizures, with representatives from China, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia all expressing their opposition to Biden's plan. And it just shows how, marginalized the U.S. is becoming on the global stage. All right, here we go about David Cameron. This is from Dave DeCamp, May 5th, antiwar.com. UK's Cameron says Ukraine has right to use British-provided missiles to hit Russian territory. So British Foreign Secretary David Cameron has said Ukraine could use British-provided weapons in attacks on Russian territory, and comments Russia called a direct escalation of tensions. Ukraine has that right. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it is defending itself, Cameron told Reuters while he was in Kiev last week. Cameron's comments suggest that London would allow Ukraine to use British-provided Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of about 155 miles, in attacks on Russian territory. A German military leak revealed that a small number of British soldiers are on the ground in Ukraine and helping Ukrainian forces fire Storm Shadows. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov pointed to both Cameron's comments and recent comments from French President Emmanuel Macron, who recently reaffirmed his position that sending ground troops to fight Russia in Ukraine wouldn't be ruled out. And on this point, I want to take a little detour here to just say that Will Porter, co-host of the show, did a very good job over the weekend at antiwar.com. There were multiple reports out that are not multiple reports, but multiple articles from notable sources saying that the French Foreign Legion had deployed to Ukraine. Will did some digging on that and pointed out that the particular source is not reliable, and so there's no reason to believe that claim at this time. All right, so Cameron also promised that the UK would provide Ukraine with £3 billion or £3 billion or $3.7 billion in funds for annual military aid, but not equipment, since the UK has depleted its stockpiles. And so they're just going to give them cash to buy arms elsewhere because they have no arms left to send Ukraine. And that, is a part of the problem that Ukraine is facing. Isn't necessarily that there's not countries lining up to give them money for weapons, but at this point in time, the particular weapons they need are just not available within Western stockpiles to even buy. All right, next up here is an article I wrote on May 3rd for antiwar.com. New York Times, U.S. covert missile launcher could lead to Xi's ouster. So after the U.S. withdrew from a major nuclear arms treaty with Russia in 2019, the Pentagon began to develop weapons that would have violated the agreement, such as a covert missile launcher has now been deployed to the Philippines as a part of the U.S. military buildup surrounding China. The New York Times reports the system to be a covert missile launcher that Washington believes could jeopardize Xi Jinping's rule as position as president of China. So capable of firing tomahawks and other munitions, the Typhoon launcher is concealed in a 40-foot shipping container and can hold up to 4 missiles. The Department of Defense first deployed the launchers to the Philippines during war games last month, after which China accused the U.S. of stoking military confrontation. According to the Times, Washington hopes to use the Typhoon launchers to protect Taiwan from a Chinese attack. Sources who spoke with the outlet believe that Typhoon strike power is enough to thwart an invasion of Taiwan and even force Xi from power in Beijing if the invasion fails. The Typhoon launcher would have been banned under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, which was signed near the end of the Cold War, and outlawed land-based missiles and launchers with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Tomahawks have carried nuclear payloads in the past, although the U.S. retired the variant of the missile in compliance with the INF treaty. So I'm sure the U.S. probably could put nuclear missiles back on Tomahawks, and I'm sure China is very concerned about that. Even if that weapon may not currently exist in the U.S. stockpiles, seeing how it's an old technology, they probably could start to manufacture those relatively quickly. The Times Pentagon reporter also noted that Typhoon system could be deployed to the southwestern Philippines for a potential conflict in the South China Sea. Tensions between Beijing and Manila have been rising for several months over dueling claims about sovereignty over reefs in the sea. The White House has reaffirmed its mutual defense pact with the Philippines, suggesting the Biden administration is ready to go to war with China over territorial claims in the South China Sea. Washington and Manila are additionally working on an intelligence sharing agreement that is expected to be finalized this year. This pact is part of a raft of partnerships Washington has formed in the Indo-Pacific aimed at fighting a future war with Beijing. And let's talk about one of those new pats. This one, we already have the Quad. Now we're going to have the Squad. Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. On Cinco de Mayo, U.S. forming anti-China squad with Japan, Philippines, and Australia. So the U.S. has been working to increase military cooperation with the Philippines, Japan, and Australia as a part of a strategy against China in the Asia Pacific. A grouping of Pentagon officials privately called the Squad, Bloomberg reported on Friday. The defense chiefs of the U.S., Philippines, Japan, and Australia met in Hawaii on May 2nd and issued a joint readout that used harsh rhetoric against China's claims in the South China Sea and East China Sea, two areas where the U.S. has vowed to intervene if the maritime disputes turn into shooting wars. The readout says the ministers and secretaries expressed serious concern about the situation in the East and South China Seas. They strongly objected to the dangerous use of Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels in the South China Sea. They reiterated concern over the People's Republic of China's repeated obstruction of the Philippines' exercise of high seas freedom of navigation and the disruption of supply lines to the Second Thomas Sowell, which constitute dangerous and destabilize conduct. They also vowed to increase military cooperation, including in the South China Sea. The ministers and secretaries discussed opportunities to further advance defense cooperation, including through continued maritime cooperation in the South China Sea, enhance procedures, and enable coordination and information sharing agreements, as well as strengthening capacity building, the readout said. The four nations conducted their first quadrilateral military exercises in the South China Sea in April. The waters have been a major source of tensions between Manila and Beijing, as Chinese and Philippines vessels have tense encounters that sometimes end in collisions near disputed routes and reefs. The U.S. has repeatedly vowed that the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippines vessels in the South China Sea. Similarly, the U.S. has affirmed that the mutual defense portion of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty would apply to the Senkaku Islands, which are Japanese-controlled islands in the East China Sea that are also claimed by China and Taiwan. Boosting regional partnerships and forming new alliances is a key part of the U.S. military buildup in the region, and the Quad is just one iteration. The U.S. has also been strengthening the Squad, which includes the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. The U.S. has also formed AUKUS, which is a pact between the UK, Australia, and the US, which focuses on technology sharing, including nuclear-powered submarines that Australia will soon obtain. All right, next up here, getting into news about the war in Gaza. Israel gives Hamas 1 week to accept hostage deal. So Israel has informed Egyptian mediators that Hamas has 1 week to agree to a hostage deal, or Tel Aviv will begin the invasion of Rafah. And I wrote this up on Friday, by the way, so May 3rd. The Israeli proposal does not offer a permanent ceasefire, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared the attack on the city will occur with or without the release of hostages. So Egyptian negotiators informed the Wall Street Journal about Israel's 1 week deadline on Friday. Tel Aviv's latest proposal calls for Hamas to release 33 hostages over 40 days, while mediators try to hammer out an agreement to release the remaining 100 captives. The Israeli offer does not satisfy Hamas's core demand that Tel Aviv agrees to a permanent end to the fighting. A Hamas delegation is expected to arrive in Egypt on Saturday to continue negotiations, with CIA Director William Burns also set to travel to Cairo for the talks. Now, one thing just to mention here is the number of captives is still relatively unknown. One thing that happened over the weekend in Israel, which was kind of just interesting. One person suspected to be a hostage was her, I believe, remains were found, mixed in with some other remains. And so apparently, due to the condition of the body being severely burned, her they weren't able to identify her remains without some kind of DNA testing. And then they finally realized that they did have this person and she was not a hostage. So the death, the remains being in the condition they were, may suggest that she was killed by an Israeli missile and not Hamas, which were mainly using rifles and things like that on that day. Although, it could have just been somehow a fire got set and her remains were burned that way. But given, Israeli helicopters fired on cars and burned bodies beyond recognition, it's very, I think, likely that that's probably how that person died. All right, so back to the article here. On Tuesday, Netanyahu said that an invasion of Rafah would happen with or without a hostage deal. The prime minister told representatives of the hostage families, the idea that we will halt the war before achieving all of our goals is out of the question. We will enter Rafah and we will eliminate Hamas battalions there with or without a deal in order to achieve total victory. Throughout Israel's 7-month onslaught in Gaza, the IDF has driven Palestinian civilians to the south towards the border with Egypt. Now 1.5 million people are packed into the southern city of Rafah, where humanitarian organizations have warned of a catastrophe should Israel press on with the ground assault. There was a report compiled on the potential death toll in Gaza due to excess deaths, as well as the Israeli military operation, and they predicted by August that would hit 100,000 if Rafah was not under invasion, at least 120,000 if Rafah was invaded. So this is expected to cause at least 20,000 deaths over the next 3 months. Absolutely horrific. So the White House is not opposed to an attack on Rafah, but says Israel must present a plan to account for civilians before operations begin. On Friday, Politico reported that Tel Aviv had informed aid agencies in Washington that the Palestinians would be pushed into the Al-Mawasi area just north of Rafah and given tents. In January, 972 magazine reported that the area was already overcrowded and there was, I think, 30 to 50,000 people there at the time. Additionally, the region lacks infrastructure needed to sustain life. One displaced Palestinian in what Israel deems as a safe zone told the outlet, "I don't know what happened to my home, but I cannot live in this desert. There is no water, there is no food. My children are going to sleep hungry, and I don't know what to do for them. They wake up at night in pain from the cold. I tell them that tomorrow we will return home. Be patient. I don't know if I am being honest, but I do hope to return home. No one is comfortable here." An Israeli official said the soldiers are waiting for orders to attack Rafah. Our soldiers are on call waiting. If we're going in, maybe that's the only thing that will get Hamas to sign a temporary ceasefire and return some of our hostage, is Israel's special envoy for foreign affairs explained. We will go into Rafah. We have to at some point because the last 5 battalions of Hamas terrorists are there. So in one way, this woman is admitting to a war crime, this Israeli official, right? She's saying that we're going to invade this area packed with civilians in order to hope to put pressure on Hamas to agree to our ceasefire. But then she's also putting down conditions that make it so Hamas isn't going to agree to the ceasefire. And they're not really helping the civilians anyway, because they're still saying that they're going to attack this particular city. So we have the talks coming to an impasse, and Netanyahu blamed for sabotage. This, Dave DeCamp, May 5th, antiwar.com. Egyptian and Qatari mediated ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas are expected to fail as the two sides are at an impasse. The main obstacle is Hamas's demand for a deal to lead to a permanent ceasefire and the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's insistence that any truce would only be temporary. There were signs over the past week that progress was being made in the talks, but an Israeli official told the New York Times that Netanyahu repeated threats to invade Rafah with or without a deal hardened Hamas's demand to ensure Israeli forces wouldn't enter the city. According to media reports, that deal was on the table would involve Hamas releasing 33 Israeli hostage in an initial truce phase in exchange for a 40-day ceasefire and commitments to work towards the longer truce. Hamas still insisted on a permanent ceasefire, and Netanyahu's threats made clear that wasn't going to happen. Hamas's political chief accused Netanyahu of sabotaging the negotiations and said that the Israeli leader was trying to invent constant justifications for the continuation of aggression, expanding the circle of the conflict. An Israeli journalist who writes for Haaretz said in an analysis piece that Netanyahu likely thought Hamas would reject Israel's latest proposal, and when the group didn't, he turned to sabotage. They wrote, Netanyahu is fleeing from a hostage deal. The closer it gets, the faster he runs to avoid it. At least twice in recent months, he has sabotaged sensitive moves towards the deal, whether through public statements or covert messages, or by curbing the mandate of the negotiation team. It was no different this time. And that seems to be, to me, a really accurate, representation of what happened here. This whole thing is going relatively how I anticipated. It does seem that the invasion of Rafah will happen soon. Now that Israel has started to release their evacuation plan, I think what they're going to do is give the people about a week. So I'm not sure if that week starts from last Friday when they first announced that Hamas has a week to set the ceasefire, or Sunday, Monday, when I first started seeing reports that Israel is ordering people into these safe zones. They're going to probably give the Palestinians a few days up to a week to leave, and if they don't, they're going to say, well, anybody who is a terrorist, and they're going to start killing them, probably in mass numbers during this coming week. I'm sure they'll continue to bomb Palestinians in Rafah. They've been bombing Rafah few times every day, killing a lot of people in those bombings, of course, because so many people are living in tents, a lot of civilians, a lot of children being killed in the bombing of Rafah. But the military operations are far more limited than I think what we're prepared to see in the coming weeks, where Israel is likely going to do what they've done in Gaza City or in Khan Yunis, which is to essentially level the entire infrastructure of Rafah, destroy the city, kill a lot of civilians in the progress, maybe not so many members of Hamas, but I don't think Israel was really ever concerned about wiping out Hamas as much as making Gaza so unlivable for the Palestinians there that one day they are able to be forced out of this strip. All right, so next up here, Israeli officials say flow of U.S. weapons is uninterrupted despite reports of ammunition delay. So there was this report on Sunday from Axios that the shipment of U.S. weapons to Israel was interrupted or was put on a hold, and this came from Barak Ravid, who is a former member of the IDF who now writes for Axios and actually won the top journalism or whatever equivalent award from the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is the big dystopian event they do every year in Washington, D.C., where they invite all the most prestigious and, really the mouthpieces, the spokespeople for the U.S. government, the journalists at the Washington Post and all these mainstream outlets like Axios, like CNN, to go. They all laugh. They kind of made fun of each other a little bit. But in reality, it's all about making sure they remain friends. And, we'll never say anything to hurt the Biden administration, the U.S. interest, I'm sure is what they say at those meetings and things like that. So very skeptical of this report just because of where it's coming from. And so Dave explains here, the Axios report cited two Israeli officials who said the ammunition hold on ammunition raised serious concerns in the Israeli government, but the sources did not give a reason why the U.S. had delayed the shipment. CNN would later report that the pause had nothing to do with Israel's plans to invade Rafah. It wouldn't impact future weapons shipments, meaning it didn't reflect a change in U.S. policy. Israeli officials told Ynet the stream of security shipments from the U.S. to Israel is ongoing. While individual shipments might be delayed, the overall flow remains uninterrupted, and we are now aware of any policy changes suspending it. Israel's public broadcaster Khan cited a political source who said Israel is not aware of any U.S. decisions regarding stopping or reducing military support to Israel. The source added it was possible that one shipment or another was delayed, but the flow continues and we are not aware of any political decision to stop it. When asked about the pause of ammunition shipment, the National Security Council spokesperson vowed the U.S. would continue arming Israel. The United States has surged billions of dollars of security assistance to Israel since October 7th attacks, passed the largest ever supplemental appropriations for emergency assistance to Israel, led an unprecedented coalition to defend Israel against Iranian attacks, and will continue to do what is necessary to ensure Israel can defend itself from the threat it faces, the spokesperson told CNN. The delay could be related, and this is what I think it is, to new U.S. aid shipments to Ukraine. Back in October, Axios reported that the U.S. delivered artillery shells initially bound for Ukraine to Israel. Something similar could have happened here in reverse, as President Biden recently authorized signed a bill into law authorizing $61 billion in spending for the proxy war in Ukraine. And so that is my likely guess as to what happened. My guess as to why this was lead to the press by the Israeli officials, and Axios made a big deal out of it, is it served two purposes for the Israeli government. One, there's probably some political struggles right now going on within the empire of who gets the resources first. Is it Israel? Is it Ukraine? Who's the priority? I'm sure from the Biden administration, the priority right now seems like Ukraine because they're losing territory, but Israel isn't going to be very happy with that decision. But two, this gets the Biden administration and everybody within the White House coming out and saying, we have no plans to cut off arms to Israel. And so, it gets everybody to reaffirm the ironclad, unfettered, unconditional U.S. military support for Israel once again. So if the Israeli officials are getting a little nervous about maybe the U.S. cutting it off, they get everyone to come out and say, we support the U.S. unconditionally again. You have Republicans attacking the White House over this report, even though, again, absolutely nothing happened here. All right, so next up here, Israeli cabinet vows to shut down Al Jazeera police raid office. So the Israeli cabinet vowed unanimously on Sunday to shut down Al Jazeera, and Israeli police invaded the Qatari media outlet's office following the decision. The broad order shuts down Al Jazeera broadcast, allows the confiscation of its equipment, and blocks the outlet's website. Israeli police confiscated its cameras and other equipment from a hotel room that Al Jazeera has been using as an office. In a statement, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu called Al Jazeera a Hamas mouthpiece and claimed the outlet's coverage put Israeli troops in danger. Al Jazeera reporters harmed Israel's security and incited against its soldiers, he explained. The U.S. has also criticized Al Jazeera's coverage of the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. Back in October, Axios reported that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had asked the Qataris to turn down the volume on Al Jazeera's coverage because of it was full of anti-Israeli incitement. Al Jazeera slammed the Israeli move and said it would pursue all available legal channels through international legal institutions to fight the ban. The outlet said in a statement, Israel's ongoing suppression of the free speech, seen as an effort to conceal its actions in the Gaza Strip, stands in contravention of international and humanitarian law. Al Jazeera also mentioned Israel's targeting of journalists in Gaza, as over 100 had been killed in the bombing campaign. The statement said, Israel's direct targeting and killing of journalists, arrest, intimidation, and threats will not deter Al Jazeera. Israel took action against Al Jazeera under the new law that gives the government the power to shut down any foreign news outlet. The ban lasts for 45 days, but could be extended in 45-day period. So just interesting here, right? How the U.S. claims, oh, we have to support Israel, we have to support Ukraine in order to defend democracy. But whenever you look actually at what these countries do, they're not democracies, and they don't value the same values that we value as Americans, particularly the one that I think Americans are, the one Americans challenge the most, or cherish the most, which is going to be the First Amendment. You look at Ukraine banning religions, the Israelis being the Jewish state, the state for the Jewish people, as Netanyahu has explained. It's not a state of all of its citizens; it's a state of its Jewish citizens. That's what his government is for. They have, banning the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and of course, committing an awful genocide in Gaza and killing over, I think now 140 journalists is the count by the Gaza, or the Palestinian Media Bureau. I forget the actual official name of it. All right, so next up here, World Food Program Director Cindy McCain says northern Gaza experiencing full-blown famine. The head of the UN's World Food Program said northern Gaza is experiencing full-blown famine that is moving south, which is a result of the U.S.-backed Israeli blockade and bombing campaign. Cindy McCain, the widow of former Senator John McCain, told NBC News, "Whenever you have conflicts like this and emotion raised high, things happen in war, famine happens. What I can explain to you is that there is famine, full-blown famine in the north, and it's moving its way south. And so what we're asking for, what we're continuously asking for, is for a ceasefire and for the ability to have unfettered access." Humanitarian organizations have not officially declared a famine, but McCain reaffirms her view that there is already a full-blown famine when asked by the host, saying that's based on what the WFP has seen on the ground. It's horror. It's hard to look at. It's so hard to hear. Also, she said, now, my understanding, and I don't know if the WFP potentially has a different metric or standard for what makes a famine, but the UN International Watchdog, the International Food Classification, I think the initials are IPC, says that it's when I think 20 people a day are, or 2 per 10,000 are dying every day of deprivation, wasting, something like that. That's when famine has set in. So if there are, say, I don't know, 3, 4, 500,000 people in northern Gaza, we're talking about a few dozen people dying every day. I'm not sure if that is actually the metric that McCain is using, but if it is, I mean, this is absolutely disgusting, a horrible travesty. McCain is the second notable aid official to say that famine is occurring in Gaza. Last month, Samantha Power, head of USAID, said she believes famine was already occurring in parts of northern Gaza. And this is, I think, pretty huge to have Samantha Power and Cindy McCain both make these statements. These are people who are well entrenched within the Washington foreign policy establishment, and to admit that there's a U.S. enabled famine happening, killing kids by one of our closest allies, and that the White House is doing nothing about it is, I don't even have words to describe it. All right, let's move on here. Talk about this article from Jason Ditz. Israeli airstrike kills family of 4 in South Lebanon. Israeli forces carried out airstrike against the home of a Lebanese family in a border village, killing a family of 4, including both parents and 2 children, aged 12 and 21. A number of others were reported wounded. Details are still emerging as to exactly what happened and why the house was struck. All indications were those killed were civilians and that it was a civilian home. Israel has, as usual, declined to comment. This is not out of keeping with recent Israeli airstrikes in which houses, often referred to as Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure, are targeted and sometimes damaged, sometimes utterly destroyed. In recent months, over 100,000 homes across southern Lebanon has suffered such devastation. This has forced some 100,000 Lebanese civilians who lived in south to flee northward and escape the near constant attacks, with their homes gone or in shambles. It's not clear, even if calm did return, what they would return to or when. Hezbollah responded to the incident by firing an estimated 65 Kalushka and Falak rockets at the northern Israeli town. Israel reported that some rockets were intercepted by the Iron Zone, although at least one man was reported injured in the strikes. Though the retaliatory strikes from Hezbollah are not unusual, this is one of the single largest barrages of rocket fire from the group yet. Such attacks almost always lead to retaliation from Israel, then more retaliation from Hezbollah. It is this tit-for-tat retaliation that and increased escalation in recent weeks that has many international officials worried that it could soon lead to a full-scale invasion of southern Lebanon by Israel. While Israeli officials have in fact threatened invasion, French and U.S. officials have been in talks to try to prevent such a conflict, and they are offering a deal which Hezbollah would be removed from the direct border area by approximately 10 kilometers. I think this is unlikely because Hezbollah is saying that, look, if we agree to this, Israel is going to have to agree to implement some things as well, and there's no indication that Israel is willing to do that. All right, this one, Jason Ditz, May 3rd, antiwar.com. ISIS attacks pro-government fighters in Syria, killing at least 15. ISIS forces have carried out a series of attacks against pro-government military sites in eastern Homs desert of Syria on Friday, sparking gun battles that left at least 15 pro-government forces dead and an unknown number of others wounded. The wounded were evacuated to hospital in the Homs province, with the number of wounded expected to rise as sites recover from the onslaught. Weakened in protracted offenses during the Syrian civil war, ISIS has been attempting to return it to its previous levels of power and influence across the nation and is carrying out a growing number of attacks. In addition to the attacks on pro-government forces, ISIS reportedly threw a grenade against a house in Deir al-Azor. Further to the east, one person was injured. This is the first big series of attacks since April 19th, when ISIS killed 28 soldiers and other pro-government fighters across the east of the country. The majority of the pro-government fighters killed in that case were from the Palestinian Quds Force. After losing most of their territory, ISIS fighters fled into the Syrian desert. Though some efforts were made to eradicate them from this area, those attempts mostly failed, and in part because the U.S. maintains a base out in that desert and doesn't let the Syrian forces get close enough to really finish off ISIS, and so that's a major problem for the Syrian government. All right, so this one from Dave DeCamp, he wrote it last week. U.S. military admits it killed a civilian in May 2023 with a drone strike in Syria. And so this is something that we covered on the show at the time. And you know, it was pretty obvious from the very beginning that they didn't kill an al-Qaeda leader and they actually killed a civilian. It was a 56-year-old father of 10 who was hit by a Hellfire missile on May 3rd, 2023 in a rural area of Syria's northern Idlib province while tending to a sheep. Evidence surfaced immediately that the U.S. killed a civilian in the strike, but CENTCOM put out a statement at the time, killing me and killed an al-Qaeda leader who died wasn't confirmed at the time. CENTCOM said the investigation concluded on May 15, 2023, and it's unclear why the command waited until now to make it public. It seems odd to do that on the anniversary of his death, and just, you know, very disturbing. This happens all the time, though, where they claim they kill members of terrorist groups, and then it turns out to just be innocent civilians. All right, one more from Jason Ditz here. 8 Syrian soldiers wounded in Israeli attack on Damascus. 8 Syrian soldiers were reportedly wounded this evening when Israel carried out a missile strike against a building operated by security forces in the Najah area of the capital city of Damascus. The strike was reportedly launched from the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and caused material damage to the building and in addition to the injuries, according to a statement by Syria's defense ministry. All right, one more article here before we wrap up. This one from Will Porter. U.S. Intel chief says Houthi attacks will continue for some time. U.S. airstrikes on Yemen's Houthis have been insufficient to curtail attacks on commercial shipping transiting the Red Sea, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines told lawmakers, saying the group is not expected to stop anytime soon. Asked about the militant faction during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on Thursday, Haines said U.S. intelligence had concluded the Houthis will remain active for some time, stressing the group's growing domestic weapons program and assistance from regional partners like Iran. Neither of these things are likely to change in the near future, she continued. Now, that doesn't mean these strikes, like the Department of Defense and coalition with our allies, haven't taken and had an impact. They have, but it's been insufficient to stop the Houthis from going down that road. The Houthis, who control a large portion of northern Yemen, have carried out a flurry of attacks on vessels transiting the Red Sea and surrounding areas in recent months, including the seizure of several ships linked to Israel or Israeli businessmen. The groups have vowed to disrupt trade in the region in protest of Tel Aviv's war in Gaza, saying its actions are meant to show support for the Palestinians. Alongside the UK, U.S. forces have carried out several rounds of airstrikes targeting the Houthis and have shot down dozens of projectiles fired from the group in the Red Sea. The latest incident comes on Thursday when CENTCOM said it downed 3 Houthi drones, which presented imminent threats to U.S. coalition forces and merchant vessels. Despite the repeated strikes, President Biden conceded in January that the operations were not having the intended effect, but he said that they will continue regardless. When you say they're working, are they stopping the Houthis? No, he told reporters at the time. Are they going to continue? Yes, and that's essentially what Haines reaffirmed to the Senate. When pressed about whether a ceasefire in Gaza might help to stop the attacks on commercial shipping, Haines said it was honestly unknown at this stage, while she added it would be a fair possibility given the prior statements by the group. The intelligence chief said the Houthis' rationale has shifted over the time and that it's gotten more complicated. I'm not sure this is the case because last week Dave DeCamp wrote up a story saying that the Houthis were offered some deal by the U.S., but they said no, not until the war ends. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more later in the week.